Tell us about finding out your child had a hearing loss.
My son, our son, Nick, had meningitis when he was 10 months old. And he ended up in the hospital for a couple weeks, and during that time our doctor mentioned to us that we would want to have a hearing test before we left the hospital because hearing loss was common with bacterial meningitis. So they did an ABR before we left the hospital. We also did our own little tests, and he couldn't hear us anymore, so we knew that he had a hearing loss before he left the hospital. That's how we found out. As far as how we felt during that time, it was a grieving process, and some of the steps we went through were just the denial was the first thing, I guess, just to kind of think it's not really a deafness, it's just a little hearing loss, or to kind of feel happy that he hadn't died, which we were grateful that we still had him, because we knew there was a chance he could have died from the disease. I was very clueless about deaf people at that time. I had never met anybody deaf. I knew that there were deaf people out there, that they use sign language and stuff, but I didn't know anybody personally. And so to think of my son as being a deaf person, it was overwhelming for us. For me, I was very depressed, sad about it for a while, because we were very heavily involved in music, and that was my first thought, was my son would be able to enjoy music. I felt really at a loss how to communicate with him, or what to say, what to do with him, because up until then I had talked to him a lot, enjoyed him a lot, and much of that enjoyment was through singing to him, reading to him, talking to him about everything. And he had started saying a few words at that time, and now I didn't know how I was going to connect with him. And it was extremely frightening to think about how would I now connect with this child that we'd waited for all this time, and that I loved so much and treasured so much, and it was just unacceptable to me to think that I couldn't connect with him now. So there was a lot of struggling going on during that first few weeks. After a few weeks, I thought I might as well find out about being deaf. What does it mean being deaf, or having hearing loss? So I looked in the phone book, in the yellow pages, under deaf, and found Goodrich Center for the Deaf in Fort Worth. I contacted them. They didn't really have very many resources for parents at the time, but they did have a couple. And I also talked to my doctor about it. When I took him back to the doctor, she said, I have another patient who's deaf because of meningitis. Would it be okay if I gave your number to that mother and she could call you? And I said, yeah, that was probably the best thing I did, because when that mother called me and we talked about our kids that were deaf, it was like, finally I thought, now I'm not alone. We have a friend, we have an ally that knows what it's like to have a deaf baby, and what should I do next? So she gave me a lot of numbers and ideas about what to do next. For example, different communication choices or education choices, or she reassured me that it was normal to go through these steps of grieving, and life would go on, and that it wasn't the end of the world, and kind of told me about some different choices I could make, different people I could contact. So one of the first things we did was to have to go through that grief process and start learning about what it meant to be deaf, start reading books about it, try to find out, to overcome that feeling of being overwhelmed before we could do anything else. One of the first choices we had to make for our child was, how are we going to connect with him? So communication style was probably the first thing we thought of. I had started reading a couple of months after our son became deaf, and I had read a stack of books. We knew that there were various methods of communicating with deaf people.